as long as my voice holds out, I want to talk about migration and gender, and for some of you maybe doing essays around this topic. It's a topic that I think needs much more attention. It's getting some attention now, but generally it's been a sort of a neglected area. When I did my PhD on women and migration, it was a really, really neglected area late in the late 90s, yes. But it's much more coming to fog now. So I'm going to run through migration as a gendered process a bit, and women on the move, and basically I will just run through accommodating females in migration theory. We'll have an attempt at it, because when I was doing my thesis there basically wasn't any, and people were really trying to say how do we fit this in generally to some of the theories often based around economics. So increasingly it is an important topic in migration, and clearly migration is a gendered process. What's changed is with this more mobile world, there's as many women moving as men. In a lot of the statistics and publications from the 80s and the early 90s, I used to get so annoyed. A migrant was gender neutral. Migrant, then if you looked at economic literature, a migrant were males. Okay, didn't include females, it just had migrant figures, because females were seen, if they did move, they followed the men. They were tied migrants. So why would they be important to understand anything? And that's where it really stood, late 80s, early 90s, where people started to say then, excuse me, do all women just migrate because they follow men as non-economic migration? Or sort of gradually coming to light that clearly women had minds of their own with the changing roles and education of women. It appeared that more women were migrating independently. Hold on, we better start having a look at this a bit differently. And when we get to a stage in the 2000s when shock and dismay, they say, oh, there's more women than men, and in some countries a lot more women. But if you went back through the stats, which I'd actually done, you'd find the USA and other places back as far as 1930s, there were more women migrating than men. So you found this funny phenomenon that wasn't being recognised as saying, well, they're only tied, they're followers, they don't really matter. So gradually people came because their numbers were increasing. But if you really look back in some of the stats, you could see stages when they were as equally as important in numbers as men. In some of those countries we talk about where they're more mobile, up to 70% of women migrating from them will be women. And then we'll have a look at different processes operating. And worldwide there is a sex-segregated labour market. So very different occupations for women in different countries and in different contexts. Migration is always selective of age, and what we've sort of added in here is sex. We need to look at males and females separately. So it's a tricky one, because you want to put males and females into this equation, and it seems to multiply everything that you do. It's much simpler. I know why they just kept saying migrants were migrants and they were men, because it was a much easier and less complex and diverse story when you were actually just looking at economic movement of men, which tends to be the case. And we're looking here specifically at international migration, but if we go back to industrial England in the 1800s, Ravenstein laws of migration recognise that more women moved from the countryside to cities through the industrial jobs, in many cases, and children than did the many men who stayed home and looked at the agricultural work. So the first proponent of looking at female migration happened to be a long time ago. It's associated with the empowerment of women, the changing roles of women, and clearly women now equaling men in terms of decisions, etc. Increased independent migration of both men and women. Clearly, if they meet, for example, independent points tests into Australia, they can just as equally come as not, at least it's not discriminated against by sex. If they've got the education qualifications, language, everything else, they are just as acceptable. High levels of labour market segmentation. In other words, there's jobs specifically for women, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute. Some of them clearly very much low paid, low status jobs. They're very much in demand because they're more dexterous and diligent for garment making, shoe making, toy making, in a lot of the expanding Asian country markets. Very much in demand as carers and domestic workers, particularly in Hong Kong, Singapore and other countries as well. We get this thing called exploitation. There's traffickers at work and sexual exploitation in particular, and abuse is rampant against some of the female migrant streams. Again, that's associated with work. They get recruited as entertainers and they think they're coming as dancers and all sorts of other things for clubs or hostesses, but they actually end up finding out are often just clearly a sex worker, and they can actually be abused, and they actually lose their passports and things until such time they pay back the trafficker or the recruiters. So they're absolutely trapped sometimes in situations. If they do, and we'll talk about this after the break, if they do contract horrible sexual diseases like HIV, etc., they can be very quickly exported from countries like Korea, for example. Sorry?
How well documented is that?
Sorry?
How well documented is that?
It's becoming much more documented. There's a journal, I think it's called Trafficking. So once you get a journal actually named Trafficking, you sort of know that is now in vogue, or it's a quite a common thing. There's articles and research in that area. I get the actual title for you, I'm not sure, but I've got one in my room, but I can't. It's called Trafficking, something like that. So yeah, there's a lot more interest, and you'll find trafficking. You'll find a lot of Russian females, Romanian, being recruited for this entertainment industry, and you'll find them in large numbers in some of the Asian cities, in Japan, Korea, etc. Many in very vulnerable situations, as I said, so it's not all good news that some of this female movement is very much abusive and exploitation. Marriage migration, well, don't know how you consider that one, but clearly that is quite a big industry, and it's been growing as well. Some of it looks to me a bit arranged and forced, other bits obviously in the normal context of people wanting to be together. This means increasing awareness and research attention. Research attention, you suddenly find these journals specifically on things like trafficking, or specifically on trying to look at connections between labour market and women's work. And as soon as you start seeing new journals emerge in these areas, you know that obviously people are doing some research. It's a phenomenon that's obviously increasing, or they're filling a gap in our knowledge. This report was done by UNFPA, 2006. It's one of the first ones to really recognise these women on the move. Who are they? Where are they coming from? Where they're going? And what are they actually doing? And I think it's a bit telling, this picture. There's a guy on a motorbike, and there's women who are women workers, young and old, stacked on this bike, being taken across the border, in this case, to work. A lot of Asian countries share borders and quite close together, so they can often be working in the next country, and that's like one of those motorbikes with a trailer on the back, and that's how they're exported. He seems to have the best job, I think. He's the one that probably is recruiting and taking the labour, and the women, old and young there, would be the ones that would be, it could be in the fields, it could be working factories, it could be all sorts of things. So this report was obviously, why is the linkage between migration and gender important? These were important reports because here is the UN also recognising we have to address this issue. And they were seeing migration can permit women to escape conflict, personal violence, cultural restrictions, or oppressive gender roles, and in so doing have great autonomy over their lives. So this is again women, if you like, breaking out, gender roles being important. Some of these Asian and other countries, not just Asian, Middle East, wherever, obviously a lot of women subject to poor conditions, cultural restrictions on them working outside of the home, and oppressive gender roles. They were actually doing all the work and being, if you like, the ones having less decisions made about what they were doing and their lives and their children. So it was seen as, okay, migration could be a facilitator, if you like, for greater autonomy for women, how they control their lives and how they actually can work and live. Migration was seen as offering economic opportunities, increased financial independence, which obviously, as we all know, if you don't have financial independence, you generally can't make too many decisions about what you're going to do. And they also were getting greater decision-making power within the household and within the family as well. Why? Because they were becoming important. Their roles outside the home, in terms of working, it could be just in a city, for example, or much of it was going overseas. There's overseas contract workers, which we have been talking about, which tend to be female dominated to some countries. So yes, it was seen this is a positive. Okay, we need to know more about how this is linked. From this report, it was saying remittances are the second largest capital flow to developing countries, nearly 3 times more than official development assistance, as much as 10% of the GDP in some countries. Women, obviously going in these flows, tend to remit more of their income than male migrants. Women use remittances for family needs such as food, clothing, children, etc., housing, education and health. So women were seen to be actually better in terms of their remittances than men. Men, for example, seem to spend more of their money when they're overseas. That could be eating, drinking, and on commercial sex workers, for example, were finding that much of the income was being gobbled up by their expenditures. Rather, women were being far more conscious of being able to save their money and send it back home. Returning female migrants can bring with them valuable skills and experience to contribute to the social economic development of their countries. They were finding they were coming back having worked overseas in factories and other industries, with those skills to the countries that were actually trying to develop them at the time. So these were seen as positives. I'm talking about women's independence just as a worker. I had a student working amongst factory workers. They're called factory daughters actually, in Indonesia. And these women, to us, we wouldn't have liked the conditions. 12 hours days or more, 7 days a week, and then they'd have a day off somewhere down the track. And I met them all going to this market. And they're very controlled because they were all women and they didn't want them upsetting the balance of male-female relationships in the village either. And this dear little girl, she's saying to me, she looked very young, but anyway, she's saying she had this financial independence. She was going to go and buy herself a nice block of soap. Soap, you know, you wouldn't have thought that was a very valuable commodity to her. And we sort of asked and other things, and, soap and, I don't know, something else. But the rest of her money was going back to her family. But she was going to spoil herself just with this soap, and there's something else she was going to buy, but obviously I didn't really think that was that important. But clearly this financial independence is very important to them, but what is also important that the money goes back to family, back home as well. So we call it the feminisation of migration, and it's basically been one of the most significant changes, if you like, in migration patterns in the last half century, is that women now constitute half the international migrant population and up to 70 or 80% from some countries. So clearly this is a change. As I said, we didn't even count their migration before. We looked at migrant men and the economic determinants of their jobs and resources. As women migrants frequently end up in this low status, low wage, production and service jobs, we call this sex or gender segregated and generally unregulated sectors of the economy, such as domestic work, which is just in family households with no rules or laws, often exposed to high risk of exploitation, violence and abuse. And now there's many countries with memorandums at least of understanding for their workers, Indonesian, Filipino maids in Hong Kong, Singapore. You're meant to comply with some regulations, and they're set regulations, and you can be prosecuted for ill treatment or murder of some of these people. Before it just tended to be they were non-citizens and they didn't really matter. So this is all from this report of UNFPA in 2006. They're particularly vulnerable to human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation and exposed to sexual violence and sexually transmitted infections including HIV, yet they have little access to medical or legal services. So therefore they have few rights in some of these countries, and the employers, if it's a household employee, etc., was found that males in particular could be abusing maids and things in the household, or sons or whatever, but there was no comeback in terms of legality. And then if they did contract some of these diseases, which we'll get to know about, they immediately get reported and they can be trundled back to where they actually came from. If they get pregnant, again, that's an absolute no-no. If they undertake risky abortions, it is risky abortions because they have little access to health, or again, they get sent home pregnant, which is not an outcome they were looking for. There's another report, female migrants, particularly on females again, bridging the gaps throughout the life cycle. So it tries to follow women, and you can see these women sorting, I think it's dates or nuts or something here. They often have very much production line jobs and long hours and unbelievable conditions as well. So talking about this feminisation of migrants, this is the world migration pattern here, and this is, say, 50% female migrants. Developing countries, you can see the red, they're the ones most likely to have these very highly feminised streams. Less developed countries, again, we've got a much lower level. So this increased involvement of women, getting up to 50% of migrants. 12% of refugees are women, and those basically 12%, 75% will have children with them. Generally, this involvement of women means high levels of occupational specialisation, again, generally in low-paid jobs that the local populations don't want. This high vulnerability to exploitation, whether it's a factory job or whether it's a household job, there's not a common labour laws or safety laws that actually protect them. The special context is particularly marriage migration, which is becoming increasingly important throughout Asia, and complex nexus with changing roles of women. So women are getting married later, the women are being more highly educated generally. Highly educated means they go past primary school, perhaps to secondary schooling. It's not as if they're going on to tertiary in many cases. So all those things are contributing. So a lot of our factory daughters, for example, in Indonesia, they had gone past primary school, which was better than the rest of them, and that's how they get their jobs generally. Their next step was, we were asking, were they going home to villages? Most of them wanted to go to Jakarta to get work, and the fear of that going to Jakarta was that they'd end up in, well, less savoury jobs in Jakarta, because that's maybe all they could get. This marriage migration, increasing intermarriage between countries, it's producing a change in attitudes to migration in those countries previously exposed to it, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. Why? Because there's a marriage squeeze, meaning there's more men than women. Women sometimes don't want to take on the very traditional roles in patriarchal societies, and the other factor is they value men or male children more than females, and clearly this is the marriage squeeze, particularly evident too in China and India. There's 3 types of marriage migration. It's called spontaneous, but it's a bit funny term, but it's a result of increased international travel amongst young adults. So more people are moving around and being exposed to meeting other young people, men and women, and so they're linking up, getting married, etc. And you can actually see that in some of the results of studies of the movement of working holiday makers. One of the outcomes is they often meet their marriage partners, etc., overseas. I haven't seen a similar study of students, sorry, but we'll see what happens there. Diaspora-related marriages or matches, India in particular, meaning the diaspora tends to arrange from overseas a suitable marriage partner and sponsors those partners. And there's also a thing called commodified marriage, arranged through marriage brokers. Just like a commodified labour market, where jobs are up for sale, so is marriage. So commodified Asian marriage is becoming very popular, and it's a key role for agents and matchmakers, or let's just say they can broker marriages. Especially important in countries where some preference has resulted in unbalanced sex ratios. by 2020 it's estimated that 25 million surplus males in India and 35 million surplus males in China. It's called bare branches. Clearly they're going to have to be matched up at some point in time with females. Also, many women in several Asian countries not prepared to accept those traditional roles. Traditional roles generally means you marry into your husband's family, then you are then responsible for your mother-in-law because he looks after your mother, and he looks after his mother, which then becomes one of your main responsibilities. And some Asian girls just don't want that. And I think I've told the story about a little Japanese girl I was with at the East West Centre in 1985, and she said the first thing you ask a boy when you go out is whether he's a first son or a second son. And I sort of said, why? And she said, because second son's all right, because you don't get your mother-in-law. But if he's a first son, you marry your mother-in-law. And I said, oh, that doesn't sound good to me. No, okay. So some very traditional Japanese, and she was highly educated Japanese, but the last thing she was going to do was actually be a traditional Japanese wife and mother. Japanese fertility, by the way, is very low, and she also said she didn't want to be trapped bringing up children. Okay, so obviously a very different outlook on life, but she was looking for a marriage partner, but he had to be not traditional and not the first son. Main destination countries: South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore. What do they have in common?
Rich countries?
Yeah, they developed, so they're higher income countries, can afford, when women are more attracted to men who have some money as well. Main origin countries: Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, Thailand and Indonesia. So you can see very distinct flows now from Vietnam, in particular marrying into Japan or Taiwan or somewhere, actually being recruited by these marriage traders, if you like. So one problem, particularly in the 90s, that I experienced was integrating females into migration theories. So Chant and Radcliffe was doing a lot of work in the early 90s, developing countries, and they wanted to include female migration in general migration theories, primarily those associated with labour migration in developing countries, because it was going on. You could see what was happening. There was females were in demand for some of these low status, low income roles. It summarises main conceptual approaches as equilibrium, neoclassical, behaviour, structuralist and household strategies. And she's got a paper that goes through each of these theories. The neoclassical approach, which has an emphasis on the spatial distribution of labour markets, was seen to be useful in the explanation of female migration from rural to urban areas, with the underlying premise that men and women move to areas which offer potentially higher wages. So, in other words, both men and women were going to work where higher wages. I would also argue in that case, most of them were going to where any jobs were available, because a lot of rural jobs, in particular more agriculture, not available for women, and they were seeking more work, higher paid work. It mightn't look higher paid to us and the conditions look awful, but it was better than what was available from where they came. And that's still going on in terms of them moving countries to fill factory jobs. Behavioural approach was seen to be more sensitive to social and cultural aspects likely to influence women's status and roles in particular contexts, although it was difficult to generalise the migration of men and women. In other words, from some of those behavioural approaches, why was that causing different patterns, or how did you understand better why men and women were actually moving? Structuralist approach, more conducive to more general and global perspectives which differentiate between male and female labour markets. It too tended to be country and region specific, with a need to be considered alongside other approaches. And that's not bad in terms of we can recognise flows to particular countries and the, let's say, the incidence of very sex-segregated markets being attractive for women. Household strategies were being seen as one of the main drivers, was sending females to work outside the family as a means of supporting the household. So my little Indonesian workers in factories outside Jakarta, they were called factory daughters. They were very young. They're often sent there to actually work, to send back money home, which my little lady I was just talking about was obviously very conscious that was her role. So jobs for female contract workers, factories, garment, shoes, toy, electronics were seeking females. They're much more polite and are much more agreeable, but they're very much more dexterous in terms of working with fine and also quite repetitive jobs than males. Well, domestic work is particularly in their fields, care worker demand, particularly creating markets for particular women ready to move to those markets. And it was household strategies, so it wasn't individual decision making. Many of these women were all part of this household network to adapt to conditions, their poor economic conditions they were using. And we were asking, what does this mean for your longer term prospects generally? And the daughter, well, they'd say, I'll come for a while, then a sister will come for another 2 years, and then I'm meant to go home and marry. But I don't want to do that. I want to go and keep my independence and my money and get other jobs in Jakarta. So clearly this is a change of attitude to some of the girls that didn't want to do this forever. They'd do it for a while. Another report, Human Development Research paper in 2009, Migration and Gender Empowerment, Recent Trends and Emerging Issues, was another good attempt at trying to look at this whole question of what does migration and gender. I almost must explain, people at the time didn't look like us saying female migrants. They wanted it in a gendered context. Okay, look at men and women. I still think some of the papers looking specifically at women gave us a better understanding of trying to put it in the male context, that they're a very distinct group and they had distinct needs, distinct vulnerabilities. Anyway, this is the next phase of this was really looking at gendered migration. They came to the conclusion the features of women migration, there were still common stereotypes that women accompany male heads of households, or unmarried women migrate for marriage or other defined work. And it was interesting, those women in the factories outside in Jakarta, when Harry, who was a very attractive young Indonesian man, would ask them if they were married or not, they all said they were unmarried, hoping, I think, that, well, they were reporting being unmarried, but we suspected some of them weren't actually married because it would come out later that they had children back in the village that their parents were actually looking after. But let's say it wasn't as acceptable if they were married, and they could get jobs more easily if they said they were unmarried as well. So I think, yes, they were actually in those factories. They're living in barracks in really horrible conditions as well. Anyway, yet the migration of women for reasons other than marriage is much more widespread and complex. So, okay, they're still saying, oh, well, a stereotype here, most of it's for marriage, but yes, we're recognising clearly there's other patterns. They say this is 2009. Diversity of female migration patterns, work becoming increasingly significant. Women migrate for long and short periods over short and long distances. So this was suddenly a revelation that clearly women were doing exactly the same as men, and in some cases more women were doing what men were supposed to be doing. Young women dominated in migration, but older women do too. And they're also recognising that we're without families. So this is one of the first times they're saying, oh, we better have a look at these overseas contract workers in particular. Looks as if they have migrated with leaving families behind, and that's what we'll talk about next week and in that tutorial as well. The female migrant flows. From that report, they say in Asia the majority of female migration flows emanate from three sending countries: Philippines, Sri Lanka and Indonesia. Why those three countries? Well, they found that the laws were more liberal than most other Asian countries, more liberal in terms of letting females and attracting females to go overseas, and that's where the memorandums of understandings were drawn up with those countries and elsewhere as well. The laws did not discriminate by gender and do not require the permission of relatives. In lots of cases, if you're a female and you wanted to migrate somewhere else to work or whatever, you had to get the permission of the male relatives in the family generally. So that stopped a lot of women being able to migrate, particularly if they were married, obviously, or if it wasn't part of a household strategy, you would have to get permission from the male members of the household. And those societies were seen to be more relaxed about sending women. And there'd been quite a long history, or over a decade or more, of those countries accepting that women could fulfil these jobs and actually earn money for the household and family and for themselves much better outside the family home. Migration, partnering, marriage migration, two main elements. Globalisation, as I said, means more international marriage, and it's movement selective of the young moving around, marrying people of their choice. And it's also that one associated very highly with gender imbalances. Since most of pioneer migration has been male dominance, often had marriage migration following 19th century Australia. In Asia now, male surpluses are leading to an increase in that commodified marriage of women and the marriage migration industry. This poster comes from early Australia, an advertising campaign in 1854 to encourage the migration of women to Australia. And so female emigration to Australia, the Committee for Promoting the Immigration of Single Women, and it says they're going to Sydney on payment of £5 only. And so again, this marriage migration followed the dominance of men, particularly to gold in Australia in the 1800s, early 1800s, and clearly a lot of the early settlers were males and male convicts. So here we've got advertisements to encourage this, to redress this imbalance in Australia. This is just 1959. These are sex ratios, and as I said, if they're below 100, here's the line 100, they're female dominated. And these are settler arrivals to Australia. So there's been times when are clearly very male dominated, and there's some peaks here where you'll find more females actually coming in. This again is your mid-90s, and right up to now just slightly sometimes more females than males. So clearly looking at the sex ratio, and you can do that from other countries, amongst settler arrivals you'll find times when females have actually been, there's more females than males. In Australia, if you're thinking of marriage migration, there's a partner visa. Partner visas are available to people who are married to or in a de facto relationship with an Australian partner who becomes the sponsor, and the application can be made in or outside Australia. They're meant to have mutual commitment to a shared life together to exclusion of all others, have genuine and continuing relationship, live together or not live separately and apart on a permanent basis. So you can actually apply for those, and 12 months, you have to be together 12 months immediately before lodging the application. Australian marriage visa, prospective marriage, a bit different. This visa is not available for people in Australia, only for people outside Australia, but they can marry an Australian sponsoring partner after they enter Australia. They have to be 18, they have to have met their sponsor in person since they both turn 18, be known to their sponsor, be able to enter into a marriage that is valid under Australian law. Prospective marriage visa is valid for 9 months from the date of grant, and the visa holder must enter Australia, marry their sponsoring partner, and apply for a partner visa in Australia within the 9-month period. The visa cannot be extended in Australia. So those partner visas of prospective marriage are really directed at, we had a lot of, it was called Filipino bride or male bride orders, people getting, male brides basically, sponsoring people they'd never seen, or if they had seen they really didn't know, or whatever, into Australia. So it's meant to cut down on some of that. There's a few more rules here. They have to be outside of Australia, but obviously if they come in on that prospective visas, they'll have to marry within 9 months. I'll just run through a couple of my tables. That this is just male and female principal applicants by visa category, and this is the longitudinal survey of Australia, wave 1. 22% of males were on spouse visas, 9% prospective marriage, 24 independent points assessment, 17.6. These are those surveyed settlers, humanitarian. Females, 47%, much higher proportion, were spouses or prospective marriage or sort of other preferential family. And these ratios here are saying how much female dominated those visas are compared to all the rest of them. Independent points assessment, very much skill business, very much male dominated. Visa categories by birthplace, you have to read across it out. UK Ireland, for example, 40% are on spouse or prospective marriage or other preferential. 50% Europe, Middle East, 67%, 2/3. Southeast Asia, almost 3/4. These are spouse or prospective marriage. Northeast Asia, 59, South Asia, 61. So very high category of females coming in under those visas. If you actually look by birthplace country, Indonesia, 72% were on spouse prospective marriage, Malaysia 63, Vietnam 74, Philippines 75, Thailand 85.6, Cambodia 65, India and China. So very high proportion of females settlers were coming on spouse perspective, very few on economic, other than Hong Kong group was more likely to. These are just visa applicants by visa categories. The younger you were, you either come as a family member or as one of these prospective spouses. 20 to 24-year-olds, the black is spouse marriage, same with 25 to 29-year-olds. And clearly, some of these older groups, this is independent migration, economic. Family was very strong, obviously, for females of those older females. Reasons male and female principal applicants gave: 52% of females said join family relatives, 39% of males. Better future for the family was likely to be male, and generally negative things like disliked economy in their home countries weren't as strong at all. So marriage migration in Asia, and that can include Australia, so a lot of that is movement to Australia to join sponsors, which means it's usually husbands or partners that have moved to Australia and wanting their prospective brides, etc., to join them. It's increasing in scale. Major destinations, as I said, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore and China. Main origins, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia and Burma. So they were also featuring, except Indonesia features strong for Australia as well. Taiwan, 365,000 foreign spouses, third of all marriages to foreigners, 15% of all births to foreign women. So they're becoming a big group, same with South Korea and same with Japan. Drivers of marriage migration, demographic factors are changing, sex balances are increasing, and obviously they were caused through selective infanticide, abortion, etc., valuing male children, not female children. Marriage to Korean men to foreign brides by nationality over time. This is just 2010. Top line here is China. This line here is Vietnam, which has been increasing, and down here Philippines and Cambodia. And if you start looking at these different patterns, it's quite interesting with these intermarriage now and mixed marriage, but it's generally women going from poorer situations in low-income countries to the higher income countries. The globalisation factors, very quickly, all the things we've basically been talking about, networks factors very important in generating this connectivity in terms of marriage and other factors. So in conclusion, we need a great understanding of gendered migration processes and outcomes. Marriage migration is an important component of settlement success for both men and women. We need more detailed studies on economic and social outcomes of migration of men and women. We need increasing importance of female independent migration, the causes and consequences, just how many of those independent women are coming on independent migration, whether it's employer nominated or not, just how independent are they, or do they have partners waiting for them in Australia? We need to distinguish between motivations of female migrant workers in developing countries compared to the developed countries, and I think we need to separate them out and actually treat them quite separately. They often get mixed up in some of this. And males can be child migrants just as previously dominated by women. And that's a change that we found in some of the survey work, that the females had the qualifications and could get in on the independent points assessment or get a job in Australia. The males didn't have as many qualifications, and they were coming as a spouse, as a tied migrant, rather than how it was always assumed the other way around. Okay, we'll finish this on Thursday.